I used to work with a man, let's call him Tom, who was a university history lecturer. And on the surface, he was this figure of just tragic dedication. He would arrive at the office at 6:30 a.m., often get locked in by security at 9 p.m. He was constantly, drowning in work, visibly stressed, always on the absolute verge of a breakdown.
Right. The kind of person you immediately feel sorry for.
Exactly. You'd look at him and feel this immediate instinctive urge to just help him, just to keep him afloat. But then I started to observe the actual, the mechanism behind all the chaos.
Okay.
He once took a time management course that suggested making prioritized lists.
Wow.
A week later, I found him staring at a notepad, just paralyzed. He had created a to-do list for his to-do list. And then he used the complexity of that absurdity as an excuse to give up entirely. He'd slump back and tell anyone who'd listen, I'm just not cut out for this.
And it worked.
It worked like a charm. Colleagues wrote his exams, they marked his essays for him, they covered his meetings. By projecting this image of total incompetence, he successfully outsourced his entire job.
It was a masterclass.
A masterclass in what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith, deceiving oneself to escape the pain of responsibility. But, while it's one thing to analyze a colleague playing this game from a distance, it is a completely different and much more painful experience when you recognize these exact same tactics being deployed by your own aging parents. It's called pseudo-helplessness. It is a psychological strategy that transforms dependency into a weapon. And if you have an elderly parent, you might be the target without even realizing it. Okay, let's unpack this.
That opening story is, it's so potent because it describes a mechanism we all recognize, in high-pressure environments, but applying it to caregiving that just hits a different nerve.
It really does.
And when we talk about pseudo-helplessness, or PH, in the context of aging, we're not necessarily talking about some deliberate, malicious plot to deceive.
It's not that simple.
Not at all. We are talking about a psychological strategy, a deeply entrenched, often desperate coping mechanism. For your colleague, Tom, it was about avoiding professional responsibility. For an aging individual, it is often about managing immense fear, loneliness, and the perceived loss of status. And PH becomes this defensive posture they use in relationships and even in clinical settings.
We have to define the terrain clearly before we get into the consequences. So let's establish a foundational definition of PH. What are we actually talking about here?
Right. At its core, pseudo-helplessness is, well, it's the conscious behavior of pretending to be helpless, pretending you're incapable of doing tasks when you actually retain the physical and cognitive capacity to do them.
It's performative incompetence.
That's the perfect term for it. Now, while we say conscious behavior, it's crucial to acknowledge the line can get really blurry.
How so?
Well, for example, some older psychological models might call this regression, reverting to childlike dependence. But clinical models today typically see regression as an unconscious defense. PH, while it's rooted in these deep, unconscious needs, is usually understood as a chosen strategy.
A choice.
A choice, yes, to achieve a specific outcome in a relationship or an environment. The person knows they could probably do the task, but they insist that they cannot.
That to-do list for the to-do list is a perfect example of that. He consciously created that complexity just to justify not acting.
Exactly.
So if we look at the underlying psychological framework, why would an aging individual choose this really difficult path of performance over just, asking for help or trying to maintain their independence?
The motivations are so layered. One of the classic explanations goes all the way back to Alfred Adler and the inferiority complex.
Okay.
For some, PH is just a tool to avoid responsibility, to escape the challenges of late life. If I declare myself incompetent, then society, and more importantly, my family, has to lower its expectations of me. I gain sympathy.
And sympathy is a powerful currency.
A very powerful currency. Then the second major driver is manipulation of others.
Yeah.
If you see me struggling with the microwave, you might feel this profound guilt, right? And that guilt compels you to visit me, which fulfills my need for attention and connection.
So PH turns your need into my obligation.
Precisely. And finally, for some, it is just rooted in deep fear of rejection if they try and fail, or a real lack of confidence in their diminishing abilities. It just feels safer to feign helplessness than to risk a genuine failure.
You brought up Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith in the opener. I really want to spend a moment on this philosophical layer because I think it elevates the whole analysis. How does acting helpless connect to this anguish of existential freedom?
Bad faith is the philosophical engine, really. It's the mechanism of self-deception that allows us to deny our inherent freedom. Sartre argues that as conscious beings, we are in his words, condemned to be free.
Right. Every moment is a choice.
Every single moment is defined by radical choice. We choose our actions, we choose our values, and ultimately we create our own essence. This obligation to choose, this absolute burden of creating our own meaning, is terrifying. It creates a feeling sartre called anguish.
And most people, very naturally, are looking for an escape route from that anguish.
Exactly. And when an elderly person claims, I simply cannot do this task anymore, what they're doing is attempting to live in bad faith. They're treating themselves as an object, a thing whose essence is fixed and defined by incapacity, rather than a subject, a being capable of choice and change.
They're deceiving themselves into believing that external factors, age, frailty, a diagnosis, have relieved them of that burden of decision-making.
Yes, the individual who opts for PH attempts to shift the entire agonizing responsibility of choice onto the caregiver. They're effectively saying, I'm an object that must be cared for, therefore you must choose my reality for me.
Right.
And this just reinforces that dependency cycle. It makes the caregiver responsible for the other person's existence, while the person using PH gets to live, for a moment, free from that existential angst.
That is such a profound explanation for something as simple as refusing to operate a remote control. It's escaping freedom through feigned incompetence. Okay, so if we move into the clinical application of this strategy, our sources detail how PH manifests using specific modes from schema therapy. Let's start with the helpless surrenderer mode. How does that operationalize the PH strategy?
The helpless surrenderer is the individual who passively but very persistently seeks to be rescued. They demonstrate this constant vulnerability or, stuckness. And this mode splits into a couple of observable presentations you'd see in a care setting.
Okay, let's start with the care seeker version. What does that look like in practice?
The care seeker is often overtly dependent, demanding, clinging. They might present as emotionally fragile, always emphasizing their feeble state, even when, objective measures don't really support it.
What's the goal?
They're trying to access an idealized perfect care that they feel they missed during their early life. And this is where that sense of entitlement often surfaces, that feeling of, you owe me this attention because of how much I am suffering.
Right. And it can get pretty extreme.
It can escalate, absolutely. We sometimes see this behavior where the individual will hint at extreme risk-like claiming vague suicidal thoughts or profound self-neglect, not necessarily because they intend self-harm, but because it is the most extreme, guaranteed way to draw immediate, intense attention.
It forces the caregiver or the system into action.
It forces them. It uses the threat of crisis as currency.
So the helplessness isn't just about avoiding a chore. It's about demanding a specific relational outcome through guilt. What about the resigned version of this mode? This one seems more insidious.
It is. The resigned surrenderer converts their emotional pain directly into physical symptoms. So instead of having to admit, I am terrified of being alone, or I am grieving my loss of function, which carries a heavy social stigma of emotional weakness.
Right, that's hard to say out loud.
It's very hard. So instead, they present with an unexplained physical ailment. Sudden back pain, constant headaches, or the classic, my legs just won't work.
And this strategy allows them to seek a solution in a socially acceptable way.
In a legitimate framework. The medical system. They want to be fixed because a fixed physical problem doesn't require them to confront the underlying shame associated with pure emotional need. The goal is still to bring in the rescuer and receive nurturing, but they deploy a physical symptom to get there.
That perfectly sets up the diagnostic challenge we're going to tackle in a minute. But before we get there, let's address the second major mode of PH, the complaining protector mode.
This is a different flavor entirely. If the surrenderer uses weakness, the protector uses a literal wall of complaints.
An avoidance strategy.
It's a classic avoidant coping style. It's designed to keep emotional intimacy at bay. By keeping the conversation relentlessly focused on external grievances, they never have to confront their own internal painful emotion.
And we see this split into two types, with the help-seeking, help-rejecting type being, I think, the most frustrating one for caregivers.
Absolutely. I think everyone knows someone like this. This person complains endlessly about their suffering, the pain, the terrible service, the difficulty of life. They invite listeners. They demand sympathy. They might even ask for advice.
But the moment you offer a genuine workable solution...
And reject it.
Immediately. A specific physical therapy program, a technological aid, doesn't matter. The problems, in their view, cannot be solved.
Why? Why do that?
because the maintenance of the suffering is their protective mechanism. If the problem is solved, they lose the currency of their complaint, and then they'd have to risk intimacy or tackle a genuine life task. They maintain the status quo of misery to protect themselves from deeper engagement.
It's the ultimate energy vampire. You walk away feeling just drained because you invested all this emotional labor, but they never wanted the solution in the first place. They just wanted the attention that came with the problem. Precisely. And then you have the other type, the belligerent complaining protector.
Which focuses the grievance outward.
Completely outward.
Yeah.
This person hyper-focuses on the wrongdoings of others, the staff, the government, the doctors. They externalize blame entirely.
So it's never about them.
Never about their own choices or feelings. It is always about the external actors who are failing them. This is aggressive avoidance. They use accusation and victimhood to enforce distance and ensure the caregiver or family member focuses on fighting this external enemy rather than engaging in any genuine emotional dialogue.
This all sounds so emotionally toxic for everyone involved. So when a caregiver is faced with these pseudo-vulnerable modes, how do we distinguish this performance from someone who is truly struggling, who is showing authentic vulnerability? What schema therapy calls the vulnerable child mode.
That differentiation is absolutely crucial. It's crucial for maintaining the caregiver's sanity and their effectiveness. We need to look at three key factors. First, the quality of the emotion. Pseudo-vulnerability often uses highly technical pathology language. I am severely depressed. My anxiety is overwhelming. But the feeling often seems superficial or out of sync with their behavior.
Whereas authentic vulnerability is...
It's expressed through core, visceral feelings. I feel overwhelmingly sad, or I'm so scared of dying alone.
It's the difference between a diagnosis and an expression of actual pain.
Exactly. Second, you look at the goal of the behavior. The goal of PH is always about control, avoidance, securing resources, often by emphasizing pathology. The goal of authentic vulnerability is connection. It's seeking genuine comfort for core feelings like grief, abandonment, or fear.
And third,
and this is perhaps the most telling, is the connection quality. Pseudo-vulnerable connections are addictive and transactional. They're constantly seeking fixing, advice, or sympathy from the caregiver. Authentic connection allows for co-regulation, for shared presence.
And that addictive, transactional nature is what traps the caregiver in what the sources call the counter-transference trap. Can you explain that phenomenon?
Yeah, so counter-transference is essentially the helper's emotional response to the person they're caring for. When PH is deployed, it automatically elicits this powerful, often irresistible emotional pull in the caregiver to become the rescuer.
You feel obligated to save them.
You feel obligated to save a person, fix the problem, or provide the perfect nurturance they seem to be begging for. However, because the patient is operating from a pseudo-vulnerable mode, a mode designed to avoid genuine connection and responsibility, they just persist in their distress and dependence, even as the rescuer tries harder and harder.
So the caregiver starts to feel trapped, used, or just deeply inadequate.
Yes. The harder the rescuer works, the more they feed the dependency. The patient, who is operating in bad faith, becomes more and more entrenched in the victim role because they've successfully outsourced their agency.
So the helping relationship itself becomes the problem.
It becomes iatrogenic. It actively reinforces the unhealthy PH pattern. It blocks any opportunity for the individual to assume responsibility for their life and emotions. And this is the root cause of that silent burnout that affects so many family caregivers. They feel like they're pouring water into a sieve.
That realization that your intense effort is actually maintaining their helplessness, that must be just devastating. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. How do professional geriatricians navigate this minefield? In the clinical setting, where real, irreversible neurological decline is common, differentiating between PH and genuine illness is literally a matter of life and death, or at least of severe medical mismanagement.
It is the ultimate clinical challenge, particularly because, as you said, the default in Western medicine is often to treat the somatic complaint first. If a patient comes in claiming acute immobility, the whole system is geared toward diagnosing a physical cause.
Right.
This is where that famous case of Mrs. Gable, which is detailed in the source material, is so illustrative.
Right. Remind us of the details of that geriatric ward case. It was pretty incredible.
Mrs. Gable was an 82-year-old patient admitted to a London geriatric ward. Her presentation was alarming. Sudden onset immobility. During the day, she was completely frail.
Couldn't hold a cup.
Her hands crumbled so much she couldn't hold a cup, couldn't move her legs without 2 nurses assisting her. Invasive neurological exams, heavy medication, all of it was imminent.
But the doctor was sharp.
The geriatrician, Dr. Aris, was extremely diligent. He reviewed the mandatory night monitoring CCTV footage, which is mostly just used for risk assessment. And what he saw was a completely different woman.
What did he see?
He saw a woman quietly, efficiently, and with perfectly steady legs, getting out of bed, walking over to the window to adjust the blinds, and then retrieving a book. The immobility and the tremor, they had completely vanished.
And the crucial observation was the timing.
The timing, yes. The moment she heard the morning hospital cart approaching down the hall, she scrambled back into that fetal position, and the helplessness resumed instantly.
That is extraordinary. She was enacting that resigned surrenderer mode perfectly to secure care.
Precisely. She wasn't faking a disease for some financial fraud. She was performing a medical crisis to ensure she received the intense, personalized attention she felt she needed. Dr. Aris realized that treating her physical symptoms would have subjected her to unnecessary surgery, heavy psychoactive medications, or expensive futile tests, all driven by a psychological plea.
And this brings us back to that core diagnostic task, distinguishing between a brain that can't function, like in Alzheimer's disease, and a spirit that won't function, often masked by major depressive disorder or pure PH. Given that major depressive disorder in the elderly, often called late-life depression, or LLD, is so widespread and frequently causes apathy and cognitive issues that look a lot like early AD, how do clinicians scientifically differentiate between the two? This must require some highly advanced protocols.
It does. And while there is that symptom overlap, memory deficits, reduced initiative, apathy, there are profound neuropsychological differences that can reveal whether the underlying problem is structural degeneration, like an AD, or functional distress, like an MDD or PH. We rely heavily on very specific cognitive tests.
Okay, so walk us through the key neuropsychological differentiators. How do you get beyond just asking, do you forget things?
Right. First, we look at global functioning. AD patients show significantly greater impairment in tests of global cognitive functioning, overall executive functions, and especially temporal orientation.
Their sense of time.
Their sense of time. Depressed patients, even if they claim they feel confused, tend to maintain a much better orientation in time compared to AD patients.
What about memory tasks? Because that seems to be where the diagnosis usually stalls out.
Memory's tricky, but the type of memory impairment differs dramatically. In AD, the impairment is due to encoding failure and actual structural decay in the brain. So when we use tools like the 5-word test or delayed recognition tasks, AD patients don't just score poorly, they show a significantly higher percentage of forgetting the material. They literally cannot retrieve the memory.
Okay, and with depressed patients?
With depressed patients, however, they often show performance deficits that look like poor memory, but it's often due to a lack of effort or preoccupation or just reduced attention, not an inability to store the information. If you prompt them or give them cues, they often demonstrate much better retrieval capabilities. This suggests the memory is intact, it's just inaccessible at that moment.
So if the depression lifts, the memory comes back. If it's AD, the memory is physically gone.
That is the essential distinction. Another really important measure is verbal fluency, specifically semantic verbal fluency.
What's that?
That's generating words belonging to a specific category, like animals or fruits, in 1 minute. It's a powerful measure of executive function. And it's consistently lower in the AD group because they struggle with categorization and conceptual retrieval. MDD patients often perform much better on that task.
And there's even a quantitative way to measure the motivational element apathy versus the pure emotional distress of depression.
Using scales like the Geriatric Depression Scale or GDS and the Apathy Scale. Clinicians look at the ratio between the two. In many AD patients, the apathy scale score is actually greater than the GDS score.
What does that tell you?
It means their primary driver is a lack of motivation or initiative, which is a symptom of neurological damage rather than profound sadness or guilt. Conversely, in the MDD group, the proportion of patients whose depression score is higher than their apathy score is significantly greater. It provides a measurable, objective ratio that helps locate the source of the patient's won't versus their can't.
So if the clinical picture is still murky after all these assessments, you have to move to the biological level. What is the gold standard of evidence used to differentiate between functional depression and structural Alzheimer's physiologically?
This relies on accessing and analyzing biomarkers, specifically through cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF analysis, and advanced neuroimaging. This is the definitive biological proof.
Because in AD, you're looking for that characteristic pathology.
The buildup of amyloid beta plaque and tau tangles, exactly. And you can see that in the CSF analysis.
How does that translate? What do you actually see?
In patients suffering from late-life depression, or PH that's mimicking MDD, their CSF analysis shows significantly higher levels of A42, that's amyloid beta 42, and significantly lower levels of total tau and phosphorylated tau compared to AD patients.
That's fascinating. So in AD, the amyloid is lower in the fluid because it's stuck in the brain as plaque.
Exactly. It's being sequestered into the brain plaques. And the tau proteins are elevated because they indicate neuronal injury. In LLD, or PH, those tau proteins are not significantly elevated, which suggests a lack of the widespread structural neurological damage that's the hallmark of AD.
So the absence of that tau pathology is the key distinction.
It's the key. It indicates that the crisis is functional and psychological, not irreversible neurological degeneration.
I am struck by the fact that the ratio of the tau proteins to the amyloid levels is the indicator. How stable are those ratios, and does, say, medication for depression interfere with this analysis?
The ratios are highly stable and reliable markers of structural disease, which is why they are considered the gold standard. While antidepressant medication can have various systemic effects, the fundamental pathophysiology of AD, that tau and amyloid cascade, is distinct and typically remains detectable. This biological finding gives clinicians the confidence they need when they are considering aggressive intervention.
So if the tau profile is low, you know you're not looking at classic AD.
Right, and you can shift your focus to managing the depression or addressing the psychological PH.
What do advanced imaging techniques like PE scans contribute to this picture?
Imaging, specifically 18F-FDG PET, which measures glucose uptake, a proxy for brain activity, is also crucial. AD patients show a highly characteristic reduction in uptake, a kind of hypometabolism, in the bilateral temporal and parietal cortices.
It's a signature pattern.
A very clear signature AD pattern. In LOD patients, that specific localized pattern of hypometabolism is generally absent. They might show some general reduction related to low motivation, but not the specific structural signature of AD.
And finally, what about the stress axis?
Yes, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis. This is the body's central stress response system. MDD is often characterized by a hyperactivation of this axis,
Leading to more cortisol.
chronically increased cortisol serum levels, yeah. It's noted in up to 70% of depressed patients. And while it's not solely diagnostic, an elevated non-suppressible cortisol level provides another physiological data point that strongly links the impairment to a functional depressive state rather than primary AD pathology.
So the clinicians have these highly specific tools to spot the difference between feigned or functional helplessness and true brain failure. But what if the system itself is forcing people into that role? Let's zoom out from the individual diagnosis to the institutional environment, where the conditions for learned helplessness are actively fostered.
This is such a critical pivot because it moves us from PH as an individual psychological strategy to learned helplessness, or LH, as an environmental consequence.
Defined by Martin Seligman.
Martin Seligman, yes. LH occurs when individuals experience uncontrollable life events or environments, and they learn that their actions, their efforts, their choices make little to no difference in changing their circumstances.
And that learned belief in futility leads directly to
Apathy, a decreased incentive to act, and critically, depression.
And the incidence rates of depression in long-term care facilities, they confirm this link, don't they?
Absolutely. The rates of major depression in institutional care settings like skilled nursing facilities, or SNFs, are consistently and significantly higher, often hovering between 15 and 25% compared to the general elderly population. Early research on this established a strong link between a resident's perception of a reduced locus of control, that feeling that your life is dictated by external contingencies, and increased depressive symptoms. When an institution imposes rigidity, it removes autonomy. And that is the perfect recipe for learned helplessness.
We have some fascinating comparative data in the sources on this exact point. A study comparing highly structured skilled nursing facilities, the SNFs, with less structured assisted living facilities, or ALFs. Can you lay out the setup of those two environments for us?
Right, so the comparison groups were chosen to represent high versus low environmental restrictiveness. SNFs, by medical necessity, are high structure. They have objective criteria for admission, mandatory schedules for everything, medication, meals, activities, and they severely limit individual decision-making about privacy, movement, spontaneity.
It's essential for safety, but it comes at a psychological cost.
It does. ALFs, on the other hand, offer a model of maximum choice. Residents choose their rooms, their meal times, their daily activities. They have freedom of movement.
So what did the study initially find when they just compared the depression scores?
Unsurprisingly, the SNF residents had significantly higher mean depression scores compared to the ALF residents. So that immediately supported the idea that a highly restrictive environment exacerbates depressive symptoms. But the key insight, the real breakthrough, came in how they measured helplessness.
They differentiated between two types of helplessness, trait and instrumental. Can you explain that distinction again? Because it's really the core of the finding.
Right. They needed to know if the residents in these restrictive SNFs were simply more predisposed to helplessness to begin with, or if the environment was causing the helplessness.
Okay.
So, learned helplessness was measured as a trait, a stable psychological predisposition to feeling helpless across various situations in life. Instrumental helplessness, on the other hand, was measured as a temporary state, the feeling of helplessness that is responsive to the current interpersonal and environmental situation.
So how helpless do you feel right now because of the way this facility treats you?
Exactly. And the results were definitive.
So what were the comparative scores on those two measures?
This is the critical moment of the study. When comparing the two groups, there was no significant difference found in the scores for learned helplessness, the trait measure.
So the residents in the highly restrictive SNFs were not inherently more helpless people than those in the ALFs.
No. That refutes the whole idea that only people who are predisposed to dependence end up in SNFs. The individual's personality was not the driver. But the SNF residents scored significantly and dramatically higher on the instrumental helplessness scale, the measure of their temporary current state of feeling powerless. The environment was actively inducing that feeling.
So what is the clear conclusion for the listener here? What does this research really tell us about care design?
It tells us that the increased structure of the long-term care environment, while often medically necessary, inadvertently fulfills all the conditions for learned helplessness. By limiting perceived control, decision-making, and personal choice, whether it's about when you wake up or what you eat or when you leave your room, the environment induces a measurable state of powerlessness.
And that state is highly correlated with depression.
Highly correlated, yes, regardless of the facility type. The environment, through its restrictive structure, can create the functional reality of pseudo-helplessness and depression in people who are perfectly capable of maintaining greater agency. The loss of freedom to make fundamental choices is an active source of psychological decline.
That is profound. The very place that's designed to save their lives may be undermining their will to live. Okay, let's shift to the ripple effect of pH on the people closest to the individual, the family caregivers, the so-called sandwich generation.
This is where pH becomes. It becomes relational warfare. And the consequences transition from psychological stress to massive financial and emotional burnout. When the aging parent deploys pH, they are actively siphoning the adult child's agency through the mechanism of profound guilt.
And we saw this devastatingly in Sarah's story.
We did.
Sarah, the 45-year-old accountant in Toronto, trying to manage a full-time career and a young family.
Her father, a recent widower, began calling her constantly 5-10 times a day, and the calls were always for these minor tasks he was demonstrably capable of performing. I can't figure out the mail, I don't know how to adjust the thermostat, the microwave buttons are too confusing.
And she felt compelled to drive 40 minutes round trip to solve these crises.
She did. And the climax of her exhaustion came when he called her, panicking, claiming he was dangerously cold because he couldn't grasp the thermostat setting.
So she rushes over, dreading a genuine emergency.
But she finds him completely comfortable, just sitting placidly. He was using the feigned incompetence to secure her physical presence. Sarah had this realization that her father was using profound guilt as leverage holding her psychologically hostage.
And when she would try to set limits.
When she would try to set limits or leave, his responses were passive-aggressive but devastatingly effective. Phrases like, "Oh, you have to go, do you? Yes, of course, work comes first," which just ensured that Sarah felt she was prioritizing money over his well-being.
So he wasn't explicitly abusive, but he was using the mechanism of pH to turn love into compulsory service.
And that is the definition of silent burnout. This pH behavior successfully siphons the adult child's independence. It prevents Sarah from setting healthy boundaries. It forces her into this toxic role of the overfunctioner, while her father abandons his adult responsibility.
And the cost is real.
It's immense. She was suffering financial strain from missed work and gas, but the psychological exhaustion was the greater cost. Without recognizing that the goal of the performance was control, rather than genuine need, the caregiver's mental health, their agency, their economic productivity, it all just collapses.
So family therapy interventions are often needed just to help the adult child see the pattern.
To see the pH and then learn how to set boundaries without internalizing that resulting manufactured guilt.
The consequences don't just stop at the personal level, though. When this strategy is deployed widely, it becomes a systemic problem, especially in state-funded care systems. Let's look at the macroeconomic consequences in compassionate systems, like the Scandinavian welfare states.
This provides a fascinating and really tragic look at the unintended consequences of well-meaning social policy. We analyzed the situation in Sweden where a municipal administrator named Lars discovered a major budget crisis.
What was it?
A 40% spike in the demand for home care assistance that did not align with any corresponding increase in severe physical illness among the elderly population.
So the elderly population wasn't getting sicker, but they were using significantly more resources.
Exactly. And when Lars investigated, he focused on a high-resource case, a resident named Ellen, who was approved for expensive Level 3 assistance. This level required a paid assistant to perform nearly all tasks: dressing, extensive cleaning, meal prep, costing the municipality thousands a month.
Yeah.
Yet later that same afternoon, Lars observed Ellen attending a community dance event, moving with striking agility and speed. She was clearly capable of performing tasks she claimed required professional help.
So why was she feigning Level 3 incapacitation? What was the motive?
The staff provided the crushing insight. In a system where social support is viewed as a right, independence is inadvertently penalized.
Wow.
If Ellen proved she could manage her own dressing or cooking or cleaning, the home care assistant, who was her primary source of daily social interaction, of company, of conversation, would be taken away.
She wasn't seeking help with chores. She was seeking company.
That was it. So feigning helplessness became the only viable state-funded currency for human contact.
That is the ultimate policy dilemma.
It is. The state was effectively paying thousands of kroner every month to manage loneliness under the guise of medical resource allocation. PH behavior was being actively incentivized by the very structure of the welfare system.
So the person who maintained independence was left isolated.
Whereas the individual who successfully claimed total incompetence received valuable, paid human interaction. The realization for Lars was that the system couldn't sustain this cost. It had to be redesigned to decouple social interaction from medical necessity, to reward independence with community integration, rather than making helplessness the key to company.
That puts an incredible burden on resources that are intended for those who truly cannot manage. Finally, we have to look at the ultimate, most devastating outcome: learned helplessness as a direct result of active neglect or abuse in care settings.
In these severe contexts like hospitalized elder abuse or institutional neglect, the psychological response is immediate and profound. The trauma just destroys the victim's belief in their own agency and control, leading instantly to LH.
So when they realize their attempts to seek help don't work,
Or worse, that they invite retaliation from the personnel they depend on, they simply cease trying.
and how does that learned helplessness manifest specifically in victims of abuse? What are the observable coping mechanisms?
The victims shift entirely to extreme passivity and compliance, recognizing this as the safest route. Their attempts to engage shift from self-advocacy to self-abasement.
So they use flattery.
They often resort to flattery and humility towards the abusive or neglectful staff, hoping to appease them and reduce the likelihood of further mistreatment. And most critically, they remain silent about the abuse, not because they forget it, but due to this intense fear of rejection, fear of retaliation, or just the ingrained belief that speaking up is completely futile.
They are essentially trapped by their own learned behavior.
Yes. And that enforced silence internalizes the pain, leading to devastating psycho-emotional consequences, profound feelings of disappointment in the system, a pervasive sense of humiliation, sadness, and an existential sense of absurdity about their situation. The LH, induced by the lack of individual-centered care and the threat of abuse, ensures the victim is compliant but psychologically devastated, fulfilling the very definition of a passive, helpless object.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together.
To synthesize the complexity of what we've explored, I think it's clear that pseudo-helplessness is not just a monolithic frustration. It operates simultaneously across 4 distinct domains.
Okay.
It starts as a deep, private psychological coping strategy, a form of bad faith, used to avoid the anguish of choice and responsibility. This strategy then presents as a severe clinical diagnostic challenge, demanding these advanced neurological protocols to distinguish a psychological crisis from neurological degeneration.
Right, and then it moves outward.
It moves outward. Sociologically, pH is a ruthless psychological tool that places an unsustainable emotional and financial strain on the sandwich generation of caregivers. And finally, on the macro level, it becomes this huge economic burden, as we saw in the welfare systems, where it's inadvertently incentivized as the most reliable currency for securing companionship.
It is a devastatingly effective survival strategy. Pseudo-helplessness ensures the individual gains attention and control, but the steep price is paid by everyone around them. The loss of the individual's own capacity for independence, the financial collapse and emotional burnout of family members, and the distortion of public resources intended for those genuinely in need. pH transforms the demand for care into a weapon, ensuring attention is secured, even if it requires the self-destruction of agency and the breakdown of vital relationships. The ability to distinguish this performance from genuine need is crucial, both for our personal sanity and for systemic resilience. This has been a deeply challenging, but I think necessary, deep dive.